Alright, welcome to Chapter 2 on the clash of economic ideas. This one is called The Bolshevik Revolution and the Socialist Calculation Debate. It's a very interesting one. So here are the list of topics for today. Let's jump right into it with the new economic policy compared to wartime communism in Soviet Russia. So this is one of the first things this chapter talks about, and it's a really sort of interesting distinction to make, where Lenin took over Russia, and he tried out what he thought socialist policy would be. See, he went and he read the Communist Manifesto, and in it Marx, the great economist, Marx and Engels, they go and they, detail this whole thing about communism, but they don't explain the exact specifics of how to implement that system in a country. And so Lenin is now in charge of Russia, and he's like, all right, let me take a stab at it. So he goes through, and he has the government set prices for everything, right? No free markets, no free property. They confiscate everything. They're like, all right, government determines prices now. What happens? Things go horribly. All right, Russia's production power, like producing power, lowers to a fifth of what it was during the Tsar. And so people were very rightfully upset. See, farmers would go and they would realize, well, the government is going to take all the food I produce anyway. I'm just going to produce less food, and the stuff I do produce, I'm going to go and I'm going to hide from the government because they're not going to pay me, fair price. They don't know what I should sell it for to make a living. And that meant people in the cities would starve. And so there was mass exodus out of the cities toward the more rural countryside where people could grow their own food and actually have something to eat. And this was really bad. You see, people were getting very unhappy because, well, they were starving to death. And so what Lenin did was he said, well, actually, that was wartime communism. When he was doing the red versus white, the civil war that was happening. He said, no, the only reason that was in place was because of the Civil War. That was wartime communism. What we're going to try now is called the New Economic Policy. Hence, on the list, NEP, New Economic Policy. And what was his new economic policy? Well, it was actually kind of going back to free markets and private property, where he ended up letting people own their own things. They introduced a lot more of the, free market ideas, where they said, all right, businesses can operate on their own, the government won't control everything. And yeah, Russia started to do a lot better after that. And I thought it was really funny how it may very well have been that the only reason they tried to do a fully state-run economy was because of, the Civil War, but I think we all really know that it was just Lenin's honest attempt at socialism that didn't go so well. But I think it's really interesting to hear about that and how the way he covered it up was he just said, actually, that wasn't really what a socialist economy looks like. That was wartime. This is what's really going to happen. And then he goes and brings back, open market operations. So yeah, the next question I have on here is, what is the socialist calculation? Because we're talking about the socialist calculation debate. Well, what are we debating about? So yeah, that one is also very interesting. The idea with a socialist economy is you have the government determining the prices for everything. And so you have to ask the question, how do you calculate what the price should be? And so that's what the socialist calculation debate is. It's, can you even determine that? And if you can, how do you go about figuring out what prices should be? And so it was a huge debate in the economic world. It was mainly between, on the socialist side, I think Oscar Lange, it's probably an American pronunciation of his actual name, but yeah, Lange, and then something Mises and Hayek, who we're going to hear a lot of. And we heard in chapter 1, we've talked about some of Hayek's stuff. But yeah, so those are the big three players that we're going to hear about. There are many other economists in there, but these are the three that the chapter really focuses on: Lange, Hayek, and Mises. So my next item here is the input side problem, and why do we not have an output side as well? So this was one of the first things that came up, and it was in some publication from the economist Mises, or Mises, however you say his name, where he said, in a socialist economy, you don't have a problem with output goods not having a market, because even in a socialist economy, you have the demand curve of people, right? People exist. You can't, just because we're in a socialist economy, it doesn't change that demand. So it's not really a problem determining prices with socialism, because it'll be sort of the same way you do with capitalism, where instead of some business saying, all right, let's try and sell it for $5, whatever good they have. Well, the government will say, all right, let's try and sell this good for $5. And they can go and see how demand reacts to that. So for, output of like finished goods and services, there's not really any difficulty calculating what their price should be, because it's the same process you'd have in a capitalist system. But for inputs to production, there is quite a problem, because now the government has some goods, right? They have, a natural resource like lumber, or, they have some industries that need inputs to produce their good. And now the government has to say, all right, how do we distribute these resources effectively? Well, that's a much more difficult question to ask when you don't have prices communicating like the worth and the how much profit you can make. So there's a really big problem on the input side of things, where it's like, okay, how much do I send to this factory? Again, let's say wood, because it's a very common natural resource. We say, all right, how much wood do I send to a chair factory? And how much wood do I send to the table factory? And without prices, right, if we just say, all right, lumber is this price, we can see, all right, the owner of the chair factory can only buy that much lumber, and the owner of the table factory thinks he can make more profit, and thinks it's going to be worthwhile. So he'll buy more lumber than the chair factory at the same price. But without prices, well, it's a lot more difficult to figure out. So what one of the theories was on how do we determine these input prices was the labor theory of value. That's our next item here. So the labor theory of value was a pretty old theory, where they basically said, all right, there's some relation between the number of hours of labor and the price of a good. They say, okay, if you spend a lot of time producing this good, well, it's going to have a bigger price. It's going to be more expensive. But it was a very flawed theory. But no one could really come up with any other theory, any other explanation. And so it's sort of what kind of stuck around. Everyone knew it was a problem. Everyone knew the flaws with it. But it sort of just got perpetuated throughout economic theory just because no one could think of anything better for a while. And to give you some examples of why this labor theory of value doesn't work so well is something like, diamonds or like gems and that kind of thing, precious metals. It takes sort of the same amount of time to go and, mine a diamond as it takes to mine iron or mine coal. But the diamond is going to be a lot more valuable, right? Even if it takes the same amount of time for a worker to, you have the crews digging down into the earth and setting up the mines and everything. Well, for all these different mines, they all produce some precious mineral or metal, and they all come out at wildly different values. Or even more of a proof of its incorrectness would be alcohol, where you go and you can go and, bottle some whiskey or bottle some brandy, and it took, how X number of hours to make that alcohol in the first place, but then you store it in a cellar somewhere, and you just let it sit there. You put in, you do literally nothing, and the price of it goes up, because now it's, now it's an aged spirit, and that, now it's been aged for 30 years or 20 years or something. And so you have two goods that took the exact same amount of time to produce, right? A brand new bottle of liquor and then an aged bottle of liquor. It's the same amount of labor to produce both of them. It's just one of them hasn't been sold for, 20 years. And all of a sudden the price of it is so much higher. And the last example is, think about like bad artwork. An artist might work hundreds of hours, on this piece that, it's their masterpiece. It's the Mona Lisa. But they're a bad artist. So they've put hundreds of hours into this thing, but they can only sell the art for like $5 because nobody wants it. It's horrible to look at. So those are some examples of why the labor theory of value isn't exactly the best theory, but it's a very difficult problem to solve. And so that's why the labor theory just sort of got passed on over and over. So the next thing we have on here is guess and check equilibrium, where they were discussing how to actually, go about setting prices in a socialist economy. And Lange said, you know what? Even if, even if we can't figure out the prices, we're talking about the input side stuff, right? Even if, all right, we can't figure out the prices, well, we'll just go. We'll set the price of wood, because, keep the same example. We'll set the price of wood to be, $10 per, per tree, right? Something like that. Or $10 per ton of lumber, cut pieces. And he'll said, all right, we'll just do that. And then the factories will go and they'll buy as much as they can. And, okay, if we have a bunch of leftover wood, we'll know the price was too high, right? And that means we have a surplus, because we have a bunch of leftover. So we'll just lower the price tomorrow. And, if we still have leftover wood, we'll lower it again. And if we run out, we'll just raise the price until we're selling exactly as much as we're making, right? And I thought that was a very interesting idea, where, it's kind of true. You don't exactly need the market to do that, because that's essentially what the market does, but it's distributed through all the different businesses, where every single business would go and say, all right, let's set our price here, and the other business sets it a little higher, and the other business sets it a little lower, and eventually all of the different people, they see how much they're selling and how much their competitors are selling, and they're able to see with surplus and shortages what the actual price should be. And I didn't really think about the fact you could do that in a command economy. You could go and just set the price, and if you have a surplus, you lower it, and if you have a shortage, you raise it. A kind of simple solution to what I thought would be a pretty difficult problem. But that brings us to the next item on our list here. Incentives. This is a big one. Because if you can just guess and check, what prices should be on the input side, and, you have people on the output side so to make a demand curve, and you can figure out prices that way, why doesn't it work in practice? Well, it has to do with incentives. See, a lot of the problems is that the people making these decisions are removed from the businesses that are affected by them. So when an entrepreneur is going out and they're trying to make a business, or they're determining what price to sell things at, they have a personal, they're personally invested in making sure that they make as much money as possible and the product they make does well, and that they can sell as much of the good they produce as they possibly can. Because any extra profit they make goes to them, or it goes back into the business where they're able to make profit in the future, or they're able to have job security, or any other benefit. But when you have socialism, where okay, all the profit I'm making goes to the government, or I should say, communism, and there's no private property, and I'm going to be in a government assigned home anyway. Why would I try harder? Why would I try to innovate? Why would I try risky things? Right? A lot of innovation has been made where companies go and they take a risk. They take a risk because they think there might be some future profit for it. Or like, think Steve Jobs and the iPhone. Who thought, having a touchscreen on a phone? No, yeah, you have buttons on a phone. You have a tiny little sliding keyboard that comes out the back, But no, Steve Jobs said, I'll take a risk. I'm going to make this thing entirely brand new. We have no clue if there's, if people are going to like it. We don't know how they'll react. And so we're going to make this thing. And once we've made it, maybe we'll go and, have a focus group to see if it's a good product. But he has the incentive to take the risk to make an incredible new technology that then can change the world. And so if you don't have those incentives, you don't have the people who are personally invested in those businesses, well, there's no incentive to go and innovate. There's no reason to create anything new or to try anything else. You just stick with what you know works, because if you take a risk and it doesn't work out, well, it's not just you lose the business, but now you have the government coming down on you. So the last thing was something, a little more of a history tidbit, which I thought was interesting, and a little bit less related to like economic theory. And that was, on the socialist side of the debate, I mentioned Lange, or that's how I think his name is pronounced. And yeah, he was on the socialist side of this debate, and he was making a lot of those pro-socialism arguments. And it was really interesting. He was a very prominent professor. He moved to America. He was teaching at all the big schools. He was teaching at Stanford and UC Berkeley and some other ones. But I remember the last one he taught at was UChicago, which is like the number one school for economics in America. Right? Everyone wants to go to UChicago. And while he was teaching there, he actually got the opportunity to go and be a part of the central planning, committee or central planning board for Poland, post-war Poland, right when they became a Soviet state. And he actually he took the job, he left UChicago as being a professor, moved over to Poland, and actually started being an economic planner for Poland, and got to actually, try and test out that stuff and see how his theories worked in, the communist Poland. And I thought that was really interesting to see. And he ended up writing some letters over to Hayek, explaining how, he's changed some of his views, and he thinks differently of some things, where he can recognize the importance of open markets, and he didn't want to be characterized as an extremist, right? He was just saying, he didn't want to be characterized as a socialist extremist. He was just saying, socialism has merit. And so he sort of changed his tune when he went and actually had to figure it out in a more like practical setting. He had to empirically test the theory and ended up finding, didn't work so well. And I thought that was really funny to hear about. But yeah, so those are my, it was 1945 when he went over to Poland to be their planner. So yeah, those are my reflections on Chapter 2 on The Clash of Economic Ideas by Lawrence White.